Okay, the next one I have, the sample is another stitch for the narrow cover stitch. And we have two versions of this one. There's a narrow cover left and right. And the reason why we have two is it's just depending what needles we'll use. If we use the C1 and C2, that makes that those stitches will be a little bit further on the left side. If I use C2 and C3, which is the center and the right needle, that just puts the stitch a little bit further towards the right. Well, if I just sew this stitch, it really doesn't matter. It's just how I guide my fabric. But where it matters is if I will combine this stitch with some of the other overlock stitches, that will just determine the gap between the overlock stitches and my cover stitches. So the right one would be closer than the left one. But the settings otherwise are the same. So I will, on my class, I will thread my machine with the right version of it. The reason for that is because one of the feet and techniques I use requires this setting. So I will use that one in the demonstration. So I will take out the C1 needle and put it on a C2, and then I move my thread also on that slot. Rest of the settings are pretty much the same. If I have a triumph, my number in here in the chain looper has changed a little bit. Earlier it was 0 to 1, now we have a little bit more tension. Again, that really depends a bit what type of thread I'm using on that one. If you have any other searcher than the triumph, it will just say cover. So we will still leave that on that cover stitch side. If the threads look a little bit too loose, you can move it a little bit towards that chain needle side on that because it is a tension dial. And for the sample, what I will do on that one, again, we could use that stitch for all the other same reasons as we were using the wide one for the decorative ones or hemming clothing. But sometimes the narrow cover just looks prettier than the wide. And one place I like to use it is to attach lace. So on this one, I just have a craft lace that I attach it into the edge of the fabric. And again, I like to use a guide, so the lace applicator foot works perfectly for that one. And anytime I use a little bit lighter fabrics and things, I shorten my stitch length a little bit. So I'm going to go to 2.5 on this. I could use 2 if my fabrics were really, really thin. That was the techniques with the wide cover stitch. Then we have 2 more cover stitches listed in here. Cover stitch and left narrow and cover stitch right narrow. It really is the same stitch. The only difference between these two is the location of the stitch. And when it matter is if I'm using it in combination of another stitch. Like on this example, that there is a cover stitch narrow combined with a 3-thread overlock. So depending on what stitch I use on that one is how big the gap between this overlock stitch and the cover stitch is. But otherwise the stitch really is the same. So I'm gonna be using this cover stitch right narrow for this one. Only reason because one of the techniques I need to use on that position. So the only difference between these two stitches are that the needles that I used. On the right version it is a center needle and the right needle. On the left it is left needle and the center needle. So all I need to do on my current setting is to take the needle out of the C1, move it to the C2, and then move also the thread the same way. So I'll move that one. As for settings, only difference on my machine, it says in here the chain loop or tension to put the 1 to 2, when all these others it was 0 to 1 on these wider ones. Again, on all the other than the Triumph, we will still leave it at the chain. But on the Triumph, we have a little dial. So in this case, I will put the dial because it says 1 to 2. So I'm going to put it halfway, 1.5 for the test, because I have only just a Madeira serger thread on my loopers at the moment. So if I have a heavier thread in a looper, I may put it back to 0. Or even really heavy thread, I may totally bypass that one. But the rest of the settings are the same. So I'm going to go and just take the needle out, move the needle, and move the thread. Well, this is another technique. I prefer to use the narrow cover stitch instead of the wider one. And this one is to attach the lace to fabric. Lace can be put in a fabric in the serger by using the rolled edge stitch, rolled hem stitch, or then we can do with the flat lock stitch. So those techniques I had done on some of the earlier classes, the number 2 and 3.
But this one I'm gonna now use the cover stitch, and just to put this, this is a craft lace, gonna put that one onto the fabric. Well, I could use my standard foot or clear foot or open toe foot, but this time I prefer to use the lace applicator foot, just because it has the guide, so I don't have to guide it so much manually on that one. And I'm gonna put my stitch length this time about 2.5, a little bit shorter stitch length. And let me put this foot in. So this one, I'm gonna put the fabric underneath, and if I want to put it in the edge, I may want to have a little fold on the edge on it too. And then I will take my piece of lace, and the lace goes on this guide. So my fabric goes under the foot, but the lace I will put on this little guide. And I kind of eyeballed the guide a little bit already. So because I'm using the needles that are the center and the right needle, so my notches that I'll be lining up will be from the left side to second and third. So I put the guide edge just a little bit onto the right side of that third notch. So that way I should get my left needle to go over that header. And then all I do is just guide in on the fabric. And I got my little thread caught up on the foot there because I didn't catch. There we go. Now, anytime it doesn't move, then you better stop, because this foot is one of these ones that doesn't have the opening. So my thread was wrapped around on that foot from the previous stitching. Again, the same rule can apply. I'm gonna lengthen my stitch length, loosen my tension so I can run off the edge of there, and that way the chain doesn't break. So here we go. Again, I have just a craft lace and kind of a gray thread, but that way my stitching is going on the head of the lace, and then underside it was covering. Again, I did not press this perfectly, I just kind of finger pressed, but I could even trim the excess because this one is all secured with the chain side of the stitching.
Here's just another one that might be helpful to use the narrow cover stitch, or I could use the chain stitch on this one too. But this is to attach ready-made bias, double fold bias binding on the edge of the fabric. So I have used, this is the sample on the left side is the one I'll demonstrate on my machine. The other one I had done in the past earlier. So it's just kind of handy to use, that gives a little nice stitching. And again, I like to use foot that gives me the best visibility. So in this time, either the open toe or the clear foot will work the best, because then I can easier kind of align that stitching right in the edge of that bias binding.
Well, here's just another little technique that I like using the narrow cover stitch. I could use the chain stitch on this one too, but this is just something that I often do if I'm attaching the store-bought bias tape. So the store-bought are these double fold bias tapes. When they've been folded, the underside is usually a little bit wider than the top, because that way when we put it over the edge of the fabric, and if we top stitch it, it wouldn't then flip underneath and we're still able to catch it. But sometimes, especially thicker materials, it might still flip. Well, in this case, if I notice I didn't line up this perfectly, but on this one, even if it slipped a bit, I still have the other needle to catch, and this edge is secure. So it was just a kind of another option. So this time I'm gonna use the clear foot because of the visibility, and I'll just wrap this edge over this piece of upholstery fabric, and then because I'm using the clear foot, I can see through there, and I have taken those thread tails, because again it doesn't have that little slit to get those thread tails, so I made sure that they are on the top of the foot so they don't get caught on my foot like on my previous sample. So this time I'm going to line up my left needle, that is actually the center needle position of cover stitches, the second notch, and I will mark. I'm going to line it up in the edge of this fabric, and then that way, even if I veer off a bit, I should be still able to catch both sides. And I didn't shorten my stitch length, so let me put them back to normal. And I'm stitching a little bit on the side, so I don't know how good my guiding is. So here we go, not perfect guiding, but got it pretty well. That's when I changed my stitch length. And underside, again, that's when I had my long stitch length and still my needle tension, so I had to quickly correct them. Again, I should hand down a test. But that way I caught both sides, and it just gives another look for the spine.
Now a little bit more alum sewing. We can do cover stitch pin tucks. They actually look more like a little bit bigger tucks, not rather than pin tucks. On the overlock side with the rolled hem, we can do pin tucks also, but then on a cover stitch side, we'll use this narrow cover. And this is the stitch that we need to have that C2 and C3 needle positions, because they will line up with this pin tuck foot. The pin tuck foot comes with two guides, if I want to do just the tucks or if I want to do a corded pin tucks. So I'll demonstrate both of these ones. The sample underneath my foot, this is the one I will demonstrate. This other one just shows some of the other sample I done in the past. And this corner is of a pillow that I had done one section on the pillow with all these tucks. And here's an example of corded pin tucks. This was upholstery fabric, so a little bit heavier fabric. So I put the pillow cord in that guide, and then I sewed, so it gave me a little bit more three-dimensional look on these pin tucks.
The next narrow cover stitch, right, stitches what we're gonna be doing is pin tucks. So these ones are cover stitch pin tucks. We could do rolled hem pin tucks with the overlock side, but these ones look a little bit like the real tucks. So this one I had just used a kind of lighter weight fabric and sewn a couple rows of tucks. On this one, I had sewn tucks, and then some of the ones are corded pin tucks. So we can do either with or without the cording. The cording in this case, I had used just a knitting yarn, so it gives a little bit of a shadow effect. To do the pin tucks, we will use the pin tuck foot. And there is such a foot for Sergers, and it comes as a set. And I try to keep mine in a little Ziploc bag, so that way I don't lose these pieces, because if I lose one of these, I'd have to buy a whole replacement set. They are not, at least at the moment, they are not available separate. So this foot, there's a groove underneath, and that groove lines up with the center and the right needle. That's the reason why I picked the narrow cover right on this one, because that will line up with this one. That setting will give me those kind of narrower pin tucks that I had earlier. I could also do a bit wider pin tucks by putting the left needle, the left and right needle, use the wide cover. That way you'll get just a little bit bigger loop on it. But most times I just use this narrow cover as the instructions are. So let me get this foot out. Again, because this foot doesn't have that little slit, the same as this one. You need to make sure that those needle threads are separated, so I can just pull them out when my pressure foot is up, and that way when I take my foot out, it comes out, and then I can put this foot on. And again, if I leave those little needle threads on top of it, they don't get caught. Well, these two pieces, the one is used with the corded, so I'll put that aside at the moment. I'll use this one first. So this piece will go on the front of this metal piece on the stitch plate. So I need to open my Serger table so I can open the side a bit, and then the shape kind of is the shape of that stitch plate, and the pin goes between the feed dogs that are just kind of underneath that are those two needles. So I just slide it there, close the door, and that'll hold it in place. That little raised bar will just lift the fabric a little bit to force that pin tuck to form. So I'll take a piece of fabric, and this is just a lightweight batiste. So I'm gonna shorten my stitch length about 2 because of the thinner fabric, and I'll have my needle tensions. I have it at the moment about 5.5. A little bit tighter tension will also give a little bit more tighter kind of a stitching. Other things that if I wanted to, if my fabric was stiffer, I could also tighten my loop of tension a little bit. I still have it at 1.5 on my machine, as the quick reference guide told me. if you have any other than the triumph, when there is just when it says cover and chain, if you move the dial a little bit towards the chain, that will tighten your loop of tension. I'm gonna leave that one as it is at the moment, and we'll just do sew a reverse stitch. So my fabric just goes over that little plastic bar, and then when I stitch, we get those threads out of the way. The needle thread still kind of there. There we go, now they're underneath. Again, now I'm at the edge. If I lengthen my stitch length and loosen my needle tensions, I can have a easier to do chain. And I always say when I do this as a class that I usually give a warning. These are the ugliest looking pin tucks you see whenever they come out of the machine. Well, what we need to do with this one is give a press, and now they're pretty. So it's just when they come out of the fabric, out of the machine, it's just kind of a pull, so you kind of see how the that little plastic piece forced the fabric to make a little tuck, and then little thread still kind of out the way there, and that will then force that tuck. And if I had even tightened my loop of threads a bit, you will see not the loop of threads as much. But lighter weight fabric works pretty good. So this time, if I want to make another row, I would just, I could mark them all, but I'm lazy marking. So I like to use the side of the foot as my guide. Just one tip, when you look the foot, these needles are not in the middle of that foot. They are more towards the right. So if I use my left side of the foot as my guide, I'm going to have my pin tucks a bit further apart. If I use the right side as my guide, they'll be closer together. So that's just again depending on how you want to do that one. So let me use my knee lever to lift the foot so I can put again my foot underneath the fabric. So I'm starting on the fabric, and then let me shorten my stitch length and put the tensions back to about the 5.5. And then all I have to do is just to watch the left side of the foot, and then I'll do that one to run off the edge. And if I don't drop my scissors, there we go. So now I have another row. Again, if I just fold it flat, that way they'll have another row. So normally pin tucks are kind of like flowers. They look best when they are odd numbers. So I'm going to do a third one. So 3, 5, 7, 9. After the 9, really, I can't anymore see. But that's just one of those kind of sort of rules that are used often in the heirloom sewing. So let me snip there. So now I have 3 pin tucks, and if I take this one in an iron, give a little start and press, and if I had used matching color thread, not this really ugly gray thread on this pink fabric, would have been even prettier. Well then, for corded pin tucks. So this time, I'm gonna change to guide for the cording, and I can put, it could be a little bit like a gimp cord or rat tail works great, or then what I could use is even just pillow cord if my fabric doesn't sew through. On this pillow, those two are just done as a flat kind of a version of, they're not a pin tuck version. I just use the standard foot for those with a narrow cover, but one in the middle, there's a pink rat tail inside, and that's what I use this guide to put that guide in there, put a cording in there, and that'll give me that little extra guide, extra dimension. So let me lift the pressure foot up, and I will take I'm gonna open the doors, take out my little guide, and then I will put my my cord guide in place. I just need to first put the yarn on it, because it's easy to put the yarn on it before I put it in place. I'm just using some leftover knitting yarn, so it's not going to be very coordinated this time, but just for the technique. So it's easier always to put the yarn or the cording in the guide before, and then I will slide it up the same way as that other guide. That's hard when I try to keep my hands away from the camera. So just to close the same way on that stitch plate, I will close the door, and then I'll have that one right underneath that groove, and then I'll take my piece of fabric, put that one on top of the yarn. So I need to make sure that it is on the top, and then I put my stitch length and the tensions back to normal, and let me stitch a little bit. So I don't need to kite that yarn at all. All I had to do was just to put the fabric on top of it, and as long as I had it kind of started good, lining up, it'll hold it in place nicely. So it just gave me a little bit of a three-dimensional and then a little bit of a shadow effect when I put it against that lighter color background.
Here's some examples of the narrow cover stitch from some of the projects. So on this tote bag, the main background, the cold color thread, that is the looper side of that narrow cover. The other ones are just the chain stitches. And then this pocket on the back, it has been sewn with this narrow cover stitch, the same as I use on the back, but I had used the shrink fabric on the background of it, and then when I steam the fabric, it gives a little extra dimension. On this next one, this was something that Beth had done for me. She was in the Serger Class and she made the back for me. So whole background on this one has been stitched using the cover stitch and the chain stitch. So the black threads on this back, they are the narrow cover stitches using the looper side, and the white ones she was using the chain stitch.
Well, cover stitch narrow. It is like the wider cover stitch, it's just a narrower version of it. So same kind of techniques can be done. So on this bag, it was used for just the quilting and using the looper side, and there was a 12-weight cotton thread in a looper. So that is just kind of another technique. Here's something that Beth had done for me. She had searched with the narrow cover stitches, again using the looper side on as a right side, and just sewn rows. The white thread is a chain stitch. We'll be doing that a bit later. And on this bag, I had done part of the back, one of the sides. I had used the cover stitch narrow for this one. So the same kind of a techniques will work. And one more. On this bag, there is a combination of the narrow cover stitch with some chain stitches, just to decorate the fabric and just to make it look like a totally new different kind of fabric. So many different techniques, because we can use the narrow cover for the gathering. So on this one is using the 4-thread overlock that I normally use. I had searched with the cover stitch, just put the differential feet all the way to 2 and then my stitch length to 4. So that way I was able to do the gathering on the edge of the puffing on this one. Only one note: if your fabric frays a lot, it may not be the best technique. So here's upholstery fabric, drapery fabric that really frays a lot. So I had done this as a test because it really gathered nicely. But the problem is that it frayed so much, so I'd have to overcast it. So my actual puffing that I used on my little table runner, I had then went back onto the 4-thread overlock because it covered those edges. So if you have a fabric that doesn't fray so much, this works very well, but on a fabric that frays a lot may not be the best option.
We have one more stitch left on the chain cover side, so the chain stitch. It is only a one stitch, even though our quick reference guide shows 3 stitches. The only difference between these 3 is depending on which one of those cover needles I'm using. The stitch looks exactly the same. Only time it matters which one I'm using is if I want to use the guides on the foot as my seam allowance guide, or if I want to combine that with some of the overlock stitches. The settings on this one, so I will just remove one of the needles. On my case, on my exercise, I will remove the C3 needle, so I will leave the center needle position. I'll take the needle and the thread out. Then on going on settings, everything else is same except the chain looper tension. Now we have a little bit tighter tension on this because we only have one narrow stitching. If it is anything other than Triumph, it'll then you'll go on the chain side, and that is not just one position, it's a dial. If you go all the way down as far as it can go, it'll be very tight tension. Most times I will just kind of go about halfway, and if I have a very thick thread, I may even leave it on the cover side because it is a tension dial. But then if I have a triumph, then I need to use the number that is indicated on my quick reference guide. So if I use the C1 needle, I have a little bit tighter tension than in the center and the right needles. So I will put my number somewhere around between 2 and 3. If I have a little bit heavier thread on the looper, I may put it back to 0 on mine, or even really thick threads totally bypass the tension, because that is a tension dial. But the settings are really referring for your normal normal Serger threads. So that is, I would go around those settings, or then on other than Triumph, on somewhere on the halfway on the chain. And then for the sample that we'll be stitching, we could use a standard foot, clear foot, or the cover stitch foot. And of course, the open toe is another option. And here's just a little sample what we'll do on that one. I'm gonna use it to seam a piece of fabric. It looks like just a sewing machine seam on the top side. Well, underside it will look like a little chain. And there's a little corner, so it's also a pillow that I had done the chain stitching. I had attached that little bias binding in the edge of the ruffle. So that was just another way to attach a bias binding. Earlier we used the narrow cover stitch for that one. And here's some other examples that I have used the chain stitching. These ones have been sewn on netting. So I had heavier thread in a looper, and then I sewn on netting. So at the back, I used a bridal tool. On this baby blanket square, I had used heirloom type of English cotton netting. And then if it is the cotton netting, I can start it pretty well, and I can just sew on top of it. But if you use the bridal tool or that kind of nylon netting, you need to sandwich that between 2 layers of water-soluble stabilizer and then sew those rows and then just to wash the stabilizer out. So that's how the fabric on this little evening bag was created. Actually, the tassel on this one is a chain stitch tassel as well.
For the chain stitch, so we have 3 different versions of it, depending what needle we are using. The left needle, the center needle, or the right needle. The settings are exactly the same. That's why they have a kind of combined checklist. So the only things on the settings, again, the length and the stitch length can be anything, but typically between 2 and 4. And then all these other settings would be the same. But then what we go on to the chain looper tension. So if you have anything other than Triumph, it will say in the chain. So that chain area is a really, really wide area. If you go all the way to the tightest, all the way to the other end where compared what the cover stitch side was, you'll get really tight tension. It might be too much. So I often just go about halfway. If I have really heavy thread in a looper, I may leave it even in the chain set on the cover setting. But on the Triumph, depending on now which needle I'm using, we have a little bit different settings. So that's only on the Triumph that we have numbers, because we have a dial with the numbers. So if I'm using the needle number 1, which is the most left needle, I would put it between 3 and 5, and then all the other needle positions, that will be then between 2 and 3. So I'm going to take my right needle out, so I will just leave my center needle in the machine. So in that case, I would need to put my setting to be between 2 and 3. So let me put that one about 2.5 then to start with, because I'm using only Serger thread, so that should work pretty good. So then rest of the settings, as I said, are the same. And then the threading, only thing I had to do is to take the C3 needle out and the thread out. So all I have is a looper thread and the needle thread. Okay, so I have taken my needle thread and the needle out. And as a reminder, when I took the thread out, I cut it from the top. But then I took my spool and wrapped it back around the spool so that I don't have it hanging up on the antenna. Because if I leave that loose thread there, it's going to catch up. So this time I'm just going to go back to the ordinary foot. I could use the open toe, I could use the clear foot or the narrow cover foot, really doesn't matter. Because I'm just going to use this stitch for piecing or seaming. So I have 2 pieces of fabric, just put right sides together. And I'll just sew a seam on here. Now this is another thing that you could use depending on what needle position you use. you can use these notches as to get your seam allowance. They're approximately 1/8 inch apart. So at the moment I have my needle at the center position. So if I count this, there's a 1/4 inch, there's a 3/8, and there's about will be then almost a 1/2 inch. So if I put my fabric edge around there, also I have those little marks on my stitch plate that I have put a sticker. That'll give me about 1/2 inch seam allowance. So I can use some of those notches as a lineup depending what needle position I use. And I put my stitch length at about 3, and then I had my needle tension at 5, and then on my machine I had the loop tension at 2.5. So I'm just gonna sew a seam, and this one pretty much looks like a straight seam in a sewing machine. Because on the top side, all we have is the needle thread. Underside, we have the looper thread. So the looper thread is a chain. So that is why the sewing machine, that's the reason why the bobbin is so much smaller, because that top thread has to go around the bobbin. So bigger your bobbin is, taller your machine gets. So that's the reason why the bobbins usually have a little bit limited size. So not like the long arm machines, the bobbins are larger, but the machine is a lot taller for that reason. Sergers, we don't have a bobbin, we have the looper. And the looper, because it's a continuous thread, will have to make a little loop. So that's a little chain. So that can be used just as a construction seam. But other use for this one also is that you could use it for pasting. Actually, any of these cover stitches, they come out fairly easily. They can be ripped quite easy. So and sometimes they come out on their own. So that's the reason that you really need to secure especially the end that you finish sewing, because in that case, if I can get it close enough on the camera there, if I put my the end that I finished sewing, if I put my scissors in there, kind of just underneath that last chain, and I snip those needle threads, that looper thread just comes out. So these are very easy to take out, so great use for if you want to use them for pasting. But then also the other disadvantage is if you don't tie them, they could come loose. So you need to secure those ends either by tying them or not, or then stitching another seam on top of it. So let me sew that seam again. I'm gonna make a bit wider seam this time. So here we go. I was going to fix the seam because my fabric was not lined up perfect. So we can use it as a seam for the construction, but we can of course use it as a decorative seam. And let me show this one first. I had attached, in this case, the bias. This is kind of a pretty bias binding, and I attached that in the edge of this ruffle. So instead of using the cover stitch, I used the chain stitch. So you kind of see that was a chain stitch I had used, and I had put kind of shiny embroidery thread in the needle and the looper. So that one was done all with the chain. And also on this one I use it for top stitching. So that is using the chain stitch there. So we can use it that way as a construction seam, but then in my bag, that one I had used it as a decorative. So this time I just put the heavier decorative metallic thread in the looper and sewed it from the wrong side. So I had first done the narrow cover and then a couple rows of that chain stitching beside it. And I was using some of those markings in the foot for the guide. Okay, this little pillow, I had done the quilting on this part with the chain stitch, again using just the chain side as my right side. Well, there's some other stitches. There's a white cover stitch used to attach that little piece of fabric, and that's a center I just embroidered using my embroidery machine, one of those large monograms. Here's a piping done in the serger as well, and these are pin tucks. So kind of just using variety of the cover stitch and chain stitch techniques on this one.
Okay, well, one more technique using the chain stitch. Again, I could use any of the cover stitches on this one too. But this is another one of my favorite ways to attach binding, actually to make the binding and attach at the same time. On this case, this strip of fabric was not ready-made bias. I did not press this one ahead time. I used a bias binder attachment. and I have 3 different versions on this picture. The 2 on the bottom ones, those ones were the original bias binder attachments that can be used on any of the 8-thread machines and also with the cover stitch machine. On these ones, one of the on the left side, it just makes a little bit narrower version of the binding. This other one used a wider one. I'll demonstrate using this wider one because my fabric is a little bit thicker that way I will attach it. But then, of course, we can just, instead of attaching the binding, we could turn it into strips too. This will be a little bit stronger strips than if I had done them with the belt loop binder because I have a bit more fabric on it. But then I have a newer one. Well, this has been around for a few years now, but it is one of the newer bias binder attachments. There are 3 versions or 3 sizes on this one. The one that I have sewn on this one makes exactly the same size finish binding, and it was created really originally using knit as a binding. And here's a little sample. I'll show this in a live video too, that I had taken a scrap of knit fabric and I sewed it on the curved edge and also on a straight edge using the knit fabric to do the binding. It's just amazing how well it worked. I had used a triple cover on this one, but I could have used a narrow cover there too. And then I had played with also with another kind of unusual fabric, which is the gauze, and I put the binding with the gauze fabric on that one too. So I will show that in a live demo.
Here's just another technique that I like to use, that this chain stitch. Again, I could use the narrow cover or even the triple cover for that one, which sometimes I've done that one. But this time I'm gonna use it to attach binding. But the binding is not ready-made binding. It was just a strip of fabric that my bias binder attachment was used to turn it under at the same time as I stitched it. So on this one, actually these purse handles, that is how these were made. I had just a strip of fabric and I had sewn it from this side. So I'm gonna see I used the looper side again, that pretty decorative thread in a looper, that I used that as my right side. So that is how those purse handles were made. So for that one, I used the double fold bias binder. And there are couple different versions. There is 28 millimeter and 36 millimeter. Again, as the name kind of shows, the 36 millimeter makes a wider finished binding. The number, what it means, this is actually the width of the fabric we need to cut our bias strip. It doesn't have to be on bias, but our strip of fabric, and then it gets folded so you get really visible about quarter of that size. So this is kind of, I had to point out that my box, this is really old foot that I have, old attachment. That was before they went to the color coding for the green one for the 8-thread sergers. And notice this one, as it says now, serger and sashiko accessory. So if you have a baby lock sashiko, you can use this attachment on that one too. So I'm gonna use the wider version. In this case, this is the one that I've had a long time. So I'm gonna use that one for my little bias, only reason because that is the width I have cut my strips of fabric. And this will attach in the screws the same way as all these other attachments. So I'm using these white knobs, and now I'm going to line up this the kind of the folded edge where this bias binding will come out, and I have my center needle position, so it's that second notch from the left. I will line it up about there, and I may have to do a little test, and just to have it exactly. I sort of eyeball it first as good as I can, and I normally do a little test. So again, I have one strip of fabric that has been cut on straight or grain, and I have another piece that I have cut on bias. So really, in this case, I'm just going to sew in the edge a little bit of a pre-quilted fabric, so they could be straight or grain, but I just usually do this on 2 ways. So this is a batik, so it doesn't really matter which way I have it up, but if it was like this other fabric I have, it is print fabric, so your wrong side comes towards you. And I will just have a little point that I will slide that little point into the slit, and either use the tweezers or that little tool will be helpful. Sometimes I use the tip of my scissors, but the tweezers are handy on this because I need to make sure that again I'm starting on a fabric. So I'm lowering my pressure foot down there, and then let me do a couple stitches, and my settings are still the same as before. And so I kind of feel that I'm catching the edge. I could just sew this way and make a tie this way. So this one is not done with the belt loop binder. You see there's no double fold. So this one I had used the triple cover stitch. So I could use again, we could use a cover stitches same way as I'm using that chain stitch at the moment. But I could just make a little bit heavier tie this way. Or then I can attach another piece. So if I attach another piece, it just goes on that little slit. There's kind of like a little slit in there. I was just going to slide it there. I'm trying to keep my hands away. So I get it in, kind of underneath in here so that I'm in front of the foot. Let's see if I can keep my fingers out of the way. And then I will just start stitching. And just to, all I'm watching is that this raw edge is kind of against this flat guide. I'm just guiding it this way. My piece of fabric is very short, so just to kind of sticks out in here. But you want to make sure that this piece of fabric, move the camera just a little bit, that piece of fabric doesn't start folding under. So when you have a longer piece, just kind of keep it in flat this way. This short piece kind of works pretty well. So again, it's just to attach the binding. I'm going to fold it the binding at the same time as it was sewn on there, attached on that one. So underside you see the chain, and the top side there's the needles. So let's do the other piece. This one was cut on bias, so this time I can print fabric, so I put the wrong side towards me. And I will go the same. Actually, I'm going to use another attachment for this one. I normally on a class we only use this one, but I have another attachment. This one can be only used on the Ovation and the Triumph. They are kind of newer versions. These are more kind of they were developed originally for knits, but they were great on a woven as well. Actually, this is the one I used on those purse handles I showed earlier. So let me use that one just because we have another attachment available too. And again, it's only on the Triumph and Ovation I can use that one. It uses the same size as bias triple fabric. And these ones come on 3 sizes. That's kind of funny. This one says in here 10 millimeters, and then a line it says 36 millimeters. What it really means is that your strip of fabric is 36 millimeters, which is the same as my other binder attachment was. It says 36, kind of barely see 36 there too. But then on this one, it turns in the end, it'll be in the 10 millimeter. There are 2 other sizes of this attachment. So this one goes a little bit differently on a machine. It goes sideways. And let me move the camera just a little bit because that's a big attachment. And this is the reason why my sewing table have those 2 extra holes. Triumph comes this way. Ovation, if you want to use this attachment, you'll need to get this table also. So then you can use this attachment. Let me get those screws. Well, it's probably when I try to keep my hands away from the camera, it doesn't work that well. Okay. And again, I can use different feet with this one. I'm just going to use the standard foot again on this time. So we still always, any of these attachments, you still have to have a foot in the machine, foot and an attachment. So now again, I would really want to do a sample first, but I'm going to try to line it up so that this the fabric piece comes from the right and takes a 90-degree turn, goes underneath the foot. So let me tighten it in there. I may have to adjust it a little bit. And lift the pressure foot up. And then take my strip of fabric. So this time we have even these little guides that I can weave my fabric on these guides, so it keeps it nice flat, so it doesn't collapse on itself as easy. And I had to weave it in there on that slot. So we have a bit of a longer way. Hopefully my little strip of fabric is long enough. And when I get it out, I'm gonna take this one. Let me see if I can keep my hands away from it. Go on the top of it. And I'm just gonna get this one underneath the foot. And this is the kind of one of these attachments that you need to start with the little bit of a longer piece of material. Let me see if I can kind of get it started. I got my fabric lined up. Needs just to sew a little bit, kind of get it started, and then I will slide my fabric on that little quilted piece on that slot so that my fabric, my binding will get wrapped in over. And this attachment was originally developed for sewing on knit fabrics, but it works really well on a woven. Actually, it says knit and woven fabric. So that is just another tool to put either one of those bias binder attachments will work. And one of my strips was cut on bias and one was cut on straight or crane. So then we also have the narrower version. So here's just took as a comparison. That was the wider one and the narrower on those standard attachments that I had used in the past. But then there's also a single fold bias binder, which on the top side, these two, and on my little sample, both of these ones I used a 28mm one. So the one on the left side is the double fold, one on the right side is a single fold. On the top side, they look the same, but underside, there's a difference. So on the double fold, we'll fold both raw edges. The single fold only folds the top one. And why would it leave this way? Why would I want to do this one? Well, it's a less bulky one. It's a great one if you do the Hong Kong finish on a garments. That way, I will just cut my strip of fabric on bias, attach it on the single fold bias binder, and then I can even trim off a little bit excess if needed because it is cut on bias. But that one is just on the top side, they look the same. So they are single fold and double fold bias binders in a couple different sizes. Plus then we have the newer ones that are really originally for knits. And I did kind of do a little test. This is the first time ever when I got this attachment, I thought, well, I'll try a knit fabric. And I sewed it over on a straight side, and then I sewed it on a bias edge or curved edge. Then I used it on this coarse fabric, which is a little bit tricky. I never been able to do that one with the older one because this one I need to have a little bit stiffer fabric. Well, this one, even this little coarse fabric, it worked great. So I attached this one aside, then I folded it in half and attached. So I was just gonna play in first with this attachment. In this time I had used a triple cover. Again, I can use this the double cover or the wide or narrow cover, or I can use a chain stitch too.
And last but not least, I'll demonstrate a couple different versions of combination stitches. This is normally something on our hands-on classes in a shop. We normally don't have time to go through the actual demonstration, but I will do on this video that one. So I'll first show one of the most common type of combination stitches, which is a 3-thread overlock with a chain stitch. So using 5 threads. And that one I had, this is a little section, I just kind of cut the fabric in the smaller piece, but I had sewn this at the same time. So with our 8-thread machines, I can combine any overlock stitch with any cover stitch that gives us that 87 stitch combinations. And then I will finally also thread the machine for 8 threads. So that is the stitch that shows on the bottom, and above there's another sample on that one. That just means that we have 4-thread overlock and a triple cover. So I'll show the machine to do all 8 threads at one time. And here's a picture of one of the baskets that I had done on a Serger Club for quite some time ago, where we use 6 threads to create a pretty edge finish. So we have the 3-thread overlock and then the narrow cover stitch. And I put the heavier thread in a lower looper and upper looper on the overlock side, and then a chain looper in here on the cover stitch side. So that just gave those nice little edges, and they're perfectly spaced because they were all done at the same time.
And then on addition for those cover stitches and all the overlock stitches we have, on the 8-thread machines we can also combine them together. So we have a few of these ones listed on a quick reference guide, and they have those both color coded. There we have the gold and the green because we'll be using both overlock side and the cover stitch side. So there are a couple pages or have some examples, plus then we have on the also some of the wave stitch examples in here too. Well, really this is not all the combinations, because I can combine any of the overlock stitches with any cover stitch. So that's why we have total of 87 stitch combinations. Plus now that we have some of those new wave stitches, I don't know if that's counted on that one. Well, this is the one I'm going to demonstrate a couple of the ones. I'm going to demonstrate the 5-thread overlock, which is the one that most other searchers, other brand searchers, that whenever we can do combination stitch, that's the only combination stitch we can do on those ones. Chain stitch combined with a 3-thread overlock. So I'll demonstrate that one because it's a very common stitch. And then other one I'm going to demonstrate on the 8-thread because we can do 8 threads in the machine at one time. So first on the on that 5-thread, I'm going to use the one that is on a quick reference guide, which we have the 3-thread overlock wide. I could also use a 3-thread overlock narrow. And now depending on which chain stitch I use, only difference is how big gap there would be between the overlocks and the chain stitch. So that's why we have more options there. I'm going to leave my needle at the center position, so mine is going to be at C2 instead of C3, so my gap will be a little bit wider. But then I will attach the O1 needle, and then after when I put the needle, what I will do is I'll set the stitch length about 3 millimeters, and I'll use maybe the 7.5 for the width. Stitch selected to A, wave at the overlock side. And then the chain needle tension, I will leave it at 5 where I have it currently. And chain looper, I leave it where I have it because that is what the settings for my chain stitch were. But then here's an important thing. Before I do any threading, now that I'm going to the overlock side, I need to make sure that I will put my upper looper selector up and rotate my hand wheel. So let me show you that one. So I'll open the doors. So the upper looper selector now needs to go up. And then I rotate the hand wheel because I need to engage that upper looper before I can thread. So that's important. I need to make sure I've done that before I thread the machine. So turn the knob up position and rotate the hand wheel to make sure my upper looper is working. So I will otherwise go and change my settings for the machine. That's the one I want to show. And then of course I need to take my sewing table out. So if I tilt a bit, so again I put my finger on that one, push gently and pull this one out so I can put my knife cover in place. So I'll go and change my machine for that one, and then I will show the stitch. Okay, so I got my machine threaded. So I have on my machine, I actually left the spools even though I don't have all of them threaded. But I have the dark gray ones on the positions which I have the cover stitches. So the center, the chain needle 2 has been threaded. The 2 others were just kind of sitting there. And then on my overlock side, I put the kind of a white color threads, and the one for the O2 needle, that is not threaded. But I got it there ready for the next one. So I'm gonna go ahead and just to stitch a piece. So when I picked up kind of a black fabric, so hopefully these threads will show okay on that one. So I have my knife also engaged, put the knife cover on, and now I'm just gonna trim off a little bit of the edge. And yep, I can go off the edge because chain stitches in any machine that can do chain stitch, we can go off the edge, no worries. But this one, I have now the chain stitch with the 3-thread overlock stitches, and I use the white. Again, I could use any of the chain needle positions. That will just determine what the distance between the stitches, and then I could have used the 3-thread overlock narrow too. I want to show one other combination stitch that I had shown this earlier too, but here's a cover stitch and then that narrow overlock stitch on this one. So that one used total of 6 threads, and that was the top side that I sewed, and then I just used the looper side as my right side. So I'm gonna go and change the machine for the 8 threads, because we can do 8 threads. The question often is, well, where would I use the 8 threads? Well, really, it would be it's not a stitch I use often, but it could be very, very strong seam. Absolutely, this will be an extra strong seam, but it could be used as a decorative. If I put a really pretty thread in a chain looper and then also the lower looper and then use the wrong side of it, it makes it really nice look like a white braid. But I'm gonna go ahead and add a couple more needles, actually total of 3 more needles, because I only have 2 at the moment. So I had all my needle places taken, and then that's really is the only setting I had to do on the overlock side. On my the cover stitch side, I just need to loosen my chain looper tension. On my machine, it goes for the 0 to 1, which if it is any other than Triumph, it will be on the cover side. It's just a little line that says cover. So let me go and add more threads, and then I'll show that. Okay, I have put more needles, so now I have a total of 5 needles in the machine and 3 looper threads, all going at the same time. So I'm gonna sew on the other side of this one the 8 thread seam. So because I am using the overlock side as well cover stitch, I have the knife cover as I had my previous stitching. Oops, got my threads tangled up a bit. That will teach me to start stitching without testing on the camera, but that's all right. That was just my little threads that got caught in them. There we go. And here we have 8 threads. Let me see, I'm going to show best in the camera. So I had my dark gray threads on the triple cover, and then for the 4 thread overlock on the white thread. And that's when I kind of got caught in there, my threads. So I'm going to put finger on that one. So on this one, we have the looper side. So if I put pretty threads in the loopers, that could look like a really nice trim. So here we have 8 threads in the serger. Only the Baby Lock 8 thread sergers can do that one. And many other combinations. So have fun.